I am a professor at Northeastern University and director of the Burns Center for Social Change and its partner project, the GovLab. I'm very happy to welcome you today for AI and Democracy's First Principles. Today's event is a continuation in our ongoing lecture series on rebooting democracy in the age of AI, where we talk with innovative thinkers and doers and designers and Imagineers who are working to do democracy differently and better in the age of AI. So this is a very intentionally hopeful series where we look at what we can all be doing to deepen and strengthen democracy and improve governance in the age of AI. And you can watch past talks and sign up for upcoming events at rebootingdemocracy.ai, and we'll put that link in the chat so that you can all sign up for future events. We are brought to you here today by the Burns Center for Social Change and the GovLab, as well as our partners in this lecture series, the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University. Okay, without further ado, let us dive in. We are honored and grateful to have here today, and we'll pin them on your screen, Professors Danielle Allen, who is a professor at Harvard and director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Danielle is a well-known democracy advocate, a distinguished columnist, and an author, as well as a mom, she wants us to tell you. And she's the author of several books. I'm going to flog this one here, and we'll put a link in the chat to Justice by Means of Democracy. She has a long bio, which we'll include a link to, but in an effort to have as much time for conversation, I won't read it all to you. She is joined in conversation today by Anthony Grayling, founder and principal of New College of the Humanities at Northeastern University, a professor of philosophy. He is also supernumerary fellow at St. Anne's College, Oxford, and the author of over 30 books. I'll only show you two right here in the screen, and we'll put a few links again in the chat to some of these recent books, as well as some of his essays and other writings and readings. And we'll put a link to those in the chat for you to buy early and often. Okay, welcome, Danielle and Anthony. What I've said to them is that I will get us started with some questions, but we are going to treat this as, if you will, virtual cocktails between them, a conversation between them to which we are happy bystanders. So I'll ask them to talk to one another, and then we will create an opportunity for you to ask questions as well coming up. So please, if you want to ask a question, put it, I believe we want to do it in the chat to enable us to see your questions. Do just write in capital letters question, and we'll moderate those and extract those after the fact, but that will allow you to continue the conversation as we go along. So in order for us to have a hopeful conversation about what to do about improving democracy in the age of AI, we have to start by asking what problems AI could be the solution to. So I wanted to have you each sort of get us started, and remember, we only have an hour, with diagnosing, at least briefly, what you see as being the greatest challenges that we're facing today. What do you see as being the greatest problems of our democracy, and where would you get us started in this conversation? We would all agree that we are definitely have a sense of foreboding and of worry. So what are you most worried about? And maybe, Danielle, let me get started with you, and then we'll pass the baton.
Sure. No, thank you so much, Beth. And thanks, everybody, for being here. This is a super interesting series, and I'm glad to be a part of it. And Anthony, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to start with some pretty broad thoughts about democracy, and then I expect that we'll fold the technology theme in sort of a second beat here. But I want to say, for starters, I always am sharing with people, I come from generations of people who have fought for democracy in very difficult circumstances. So my grandpa, J.P. Allen, in Northern Florida, helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in that area in the 40s, when lynchings were on the rise. So literally sort of life and death questions were at stake. He was committed, though, to a notion of his own empowerment as a decision maker in our society. And similarly, on my other side, my great-grandparents on my mom's side helped fight for women's right to vote. My great-granddad marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917. And same thing there. They were both often told that various pathways to empowerment were impossible. Social equality for African Americans in the South was impossible, or women having the right to vote was impossible. And their view was, no, these things were in fact necessary. And so the only question was how. And I share that little bit of family history only because it goes really deep in my own thinking about democracy. I see democracy as, in effect, the vehicle, the mechanism for providing human beings with empowerment. I see empowerment as necessary to a flourishing life for individuals, for families, for communities. So I start there because I just wanted to name the value of democracy. Why does self-government, in some sense, matter? I think it matters because it permits people to shape the course of their own lives and the lives of the community that they're a part of. So then the question is, what challenges do we face right now with regard to democracy and that value for human beings? For the modern period, democracy has functioned with representation at its core. And so if democracy is going to succeed, it's because something that we call representation succeeds. And that's what I want to say is the thing that's under greatest pressure right now. Whether or not representation as such, the idea that you sort of select people to speak for you, and then there's a decision-making structure that you have some sense of connection to and have some legitimacy, has some legitimacy because of that connection, whether that is sufficiently robust in current conditions. The problem of representation has been where we've developed problems with representation, not only because of technology, also because of the shape of the economy, which means significant wealth capture of our institutions of representation, issues of changing demography, increasing size and scale of our population so that representatives are much more distant from constituents than in earlier periods. So there are a lot of changes to our society, complexification and the like, that really erode representation as a vehicle for delivering that experience of empowerment. I have a lot to say about how technology then really exacerbates some of those fundamental kind of fragilities for representation. But let me stop there because I would love to hear what sort of Antony is thinking about in the biggest picture sense when he thinks about challenges to democracy right now.
Well, hello, Danielle and Beth and everybody there. It's great to see you. Well, I'll pick up straight away on two very important things that Danielle has said, and which I hugely agree with. One thing that we have to remember is that a lot of people fought very, very hard for democracy at great cost. And in fact, here we sit in the 2020s, and it's not really more than a century that it began to look as if it really was democracy. I mean, never forget, when Lincoln made that famous speech saying democracy is government of the people, by the people, for the people, the second occurrence of the word people in that remark it denoted only white men who owned property. Certainly didn't denote everybody, even though the government was of everybody and for everybody. And it was a long, hard battle to get representation for everybody. So that's point number one. This was something hard fought for, and it's something very well worth continuing to fight for. My own view is that because the increase of the franchise went hand in hand, actually produced really tighter and tighter political party organization, the great danger identified by Madison in the 10th Federalist paper, the danger of factionalism, of a competition between political organizations to get their hands on the levers of power. That meant that the kind of weaknesses of a democratic set of institutions came to be identified and played long before technology really got into the picture. And in some respects, technology has weaponized some of those problems and made them worse. But technology also has some positive aspects too. We'll come to those. We'll talk about ways in which more deliberative processes in democracy might be much enhanced by the use of AI and by the use of ways of aggregating people technologically so that they can discuss and debate, share opinions and learn from one another and come to some agreements. So we'll see how that might work. But the absolutely key thing, and Danielle has put her finger right on this, is the question of representation. But we don't have either, I think, in the United States, and I speak as a diffident external observer of the system there, but a very interested one, and certainly not in the UK, and in about 50 other countries around the world, which are modeled on the so-called Westminster system, of which, by the way, the US system is a descendant or a version. But in a lot of those democracies, the electoral system used is a plurality system, first past the post. This is the way the House of Representatives is elected in the US. It's the way the British Parliament is elected, the House of Commons. And this is a very, very bad electoral system because it, in too many cases, causes a two-party opposition to emerge, squeezes out third parties. As a result, you can get divisions, sometimes very bitter divisions, between the two parties who benefit from this system. So a lot of voices are squeezed out, and the options that people have and the ability that they have to contribute is limited thereby. So a very careful look at the electoral arrangements of a democracy are part of the key to this. The other thing, of course, is that you have to recognize that there can be problems on both sides of the story. On one side of the story are the institutions, election, the nature of the constitution, the bodies of elected representatives, how they operate and function, what the limits on their powers are, what their duties are, how we can get a remedy against them if they misbehave themselves. So there are institutional questions. But on the side of the electors, I mean, in the ideal, a democracy is a system in which the people who vote are well-informed, thoughtful, take into account the interests and needs of people who are not in their own circle or closed group, and who want to see the common good prevail. And, you know, a very, very long time ago, 2,500 years ago, and you'll read it in Book 8 of Plato's Republic, it was already spotted that I'm afraid that there are too many folks who aren't well informed and are too self-interested and who aren't very considerate about the needs of the overall community or what the common good might be. And this means that there is a real challenge here about how we educate for democracy, how we encourage people to be really rational and committed participants in the process. And here maybe is one of the ways that technology can help, but perhaps we'll come to that in a bit.
Well, so I was going to jump in and share some thoughts about how technology has ratcheted up the challenges so that we can really get ourselves into a sort of state of anxiety before we then open out toward talking about solutions. And I mean, you've already pointed to some of them, Anthony, but I do think it's an extraordinary thing to recognize that a democracy is a sort of quite complicated mechanism. You were just going through some of the very precise mechanisms that all work together to produce this experience of self-government. And I often think of the mechanisms of 18th century constitutionalism as something like the mechanisms of a clock, a sort of a wind-up clock with all the sort of gears connecting and the like. And so we find ourselves with that set of mechanisms now having to work in very different conditions, and some of the originally understood or taken as given conditions no longer apply. So most obviously is the fact that when the folks designed the mechanisms in the 18th century in the US case, they saw geographic dispersal as part of the solution. That would be a break on the problem of faction. So Madison in the Federalist Papers, right, makes the case that the solution to the problem of faction is representative democracy in a broad republic, where the very breadth will mean that people with extreme views will have difficulty finding each other. So they'll have to pass their views through a representative to get them into the public sphere. And then that representative will have the job of filtering and mediating and producing, in effect, that healthy information ecosystem that you were just alluding to as necessary for a healthy democracy. So of course, that's been exploded for us. There's no longer any of that sort of mediating structure to ensure that the information ecosystem for decision-making is healthy or filters out sort of extremist positions and the like. So there's a real question of how representation needs to be redesigned in that circumstance. I think we're tackling that right now a lot by thinking about misinformation. the question of how that develops and circulates and the way that undermines confidence in institutions, undermines confidence in decisions, undermines people's ability to form collaborative relationships across lines of difference, and the like. So that's a very significant component of the problem. But also in general, I think we often take for granted some of the sort of rough and ready forms of validity our systems depend on. So if you look really closely at any election system from the 19th or 20th century, you know, there's an awful lot of like spit and band-aids and paper tape holding the thing together. There's an awful lot of like taking it on good faith that the whole thing is valid and every vote's been exactly counted and the like. And now that we're in a universe where it's really possible to kind of audit and scrutinize quite precisely, it's much easier to see the gap between the reality of any kind of election system, which is a very cumbersome thing to operate, and the claims we make about our election system. So for that reason, too, we have real challenges around concepts of election integrity and the like. So one can kind of walk through the different sort of institutional pillars of a healthy democracy. And for every single one of them, there is a way in which technological innovation in the present has made the wind-up clock of the 18th century no longer really valid or perfectly functional or viable in current circumstances. So we have a very significant amount of redesign work to do, in my view.
Maybe let me
Yes,
just
I
ask both
agree
of
with that.
you. Oh, by all means, Anthony. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Beth. No, I just wanted very much to agree with Danielle there. I mean, one of the upsides of technology is that you could have a very clean, very transparent, very secure voting system by those tech means, and that's very desirable. On the other hand, of course, there's the problem that all our technologies are vulnerable to some degree, vulnerable to hacking, for example, or interference. And the really serious downsides of particularly of AI that are live and may very well be being implemented even as we speak in this hugely important year of elections, massively important in the US, but there are elections all around the world which are very significant this year. I've never known a year with so many elections where big things might happen. For example, deep fakes, interference in and editing of political messaging that has been sent up by one party, so a bad actor might be able to hack into it and put in a few words like not or cross them out. There are all sorts of ways in which these kinds of interventions might happen. And if you consider the situation in the US, again, even as we speak now, there has been some pressure to try to introduce some sort of legislation in Congress that would, manage the use of AI in the electoral process, in the campaigning process. And although there is some consensus in the Senate about it, it hasn't generated yet an ability to deal with it properly. Of course, there are a huge number of problems that have to be dealt with right across the board with AI use. But in an election year of this importance, even just focusing down on that is something which would seem to be an urgency. So, there are upsides and there are downsides, seriously. But when we think about how we're to deal with them, at least two things need to be addressed. One is, what is it about our democratic processes and our institutions and practices that we wanted to try to enhance by the use of AI? Again, I advert to that point about how you can really make very good use of it indeed to get deliberative processes working among voters. And that would be hugely significant if you could roll that out in a very large scale way. And the other thing is to make sure that when AI is used in the electoral processes, that should be transparent and it should be governed. I mean, I've always thought that with respect to AI about anything, including ChatGPT and, any use of AI, that AI systems should come watermarked so that everybody can see that AI is involved, what it's done, and where it comes from. Now, that would be a real desideratum for me. And in the case of our democratic practices, at any rate, it would seem to me to be crucial.
Before we go down the rabbit hole of some of the policy prescriptions here, I wanted to just challenge for a moment the proposition you've given us that the goal here, if we are seeking to empower people, is to strengthen and improve our representative systems. So I just want to challenge kind of the initial notion, because we've had others who have come on here. Brooke Manville and Josh Ober were here a few weeks ago talking really about civic virtue and friendship and problem solving. We've had, you've just alluded to sort of the deliberative moment that we're in. And I see a number of people here who are kind of pioneers in the space of citizen deliberation. There's obviously technologies creating new opportunities for citizen engagement and decision making and more direct forms of democracy. So I just want to ask for a moment about why the technological moment we're in hasn't caused you to say, or perhaps the political moment, the least productive Congress we've ever had in history. I don't have to give you a litany of all the challenges. Why the doubling down on the representative as the central proposition you both put forward?
So since I launched that first, let me go ahead and own that one, Beth, and Anthony may want to even diverge from my starting point. So it's not that I don't think the other things matter. I do. I think questions of civic culture are hugely important as well. It's not either or by any stretch of the imagination. So I do think the kind of work that Josh Ober and Brooke Manville do is valuable, and we should be taking it seriously. Relatedly, I do also think the opportunities for deliberation are incredibly valuable. It's just that I think that what we are going to want to do ultimately is embed them in our existing structures of representation. So rather than, there's sort of, some folks make the case that maybe it's time to just sort of dispense with representative systems and replace them with nested sets of deliberative assemblies. I'm sure there are many different pictures for how one might design that. And the reason I think that representation continues to matter is because I do think that, for starters, I think geographic districts still matter. Not that you can't use those, you can also use geographic districts with deliberative assemblies, but the structure that we have already built up, the infrastructure that we've already built up, is a very important decision-making apparatus. It's a very important sort of vehicle of collective intelligence. And from my point of view, it seems much more important to evolve a structure that still is doing a lot of good work rather than to think that the time is here simply to replace it. So I think it's got a lot of vulnerabilities. And I do think that deliberative mechanisms inserted into our representative structures will massively improve our representative structures, will increase legitimacy, will improve the quality of decision-making and the like. But I do think that the fact that the existing sort of decision-making apparatus, the fact that there's been a kind of order of operations to which decisions get made, where, when, and how, jurisdictionally, and the like, that itself reflects a huge accumulation of social intelligence that it would be very damaging to lose.
Anthony, do you want to add anything here, or shall we move back to your point? We can start to talk about where tech comes into this.
Well, just to say very quickly about this, that there are, there sort of opposing pressures at work here. On the one hand, it's tremendously important to get the kind of empowerment of individuals and to make people feel that they really are signed up in society, that they should feel that they are heard, that they have a voice, and that when they express their views, that does feed in and it does make some kind of difference. Because when people feel voiceless or shut up, if they're kept out on the other side of the gate, or if they don't think that their vote makes a difference, then it frustrates them. And frustration in society, especially in our current Western world and in our current Western economies, where economic injustice has increased so hugely recently, and there are lots of people who feel frustrated because of that, and then they can't have a say about it or feel that they can make a difference to it, then that frustration becomes toxic in society. So the one pressure is, people must have a voice, and that voice must be heard, and therefore there must be mechanisms, got to be institutions, deliberative assemblies, whatever it takes, so that they feel they want to have a say, they can have a say, and that it will be inputted into the process. On the other hand, the opposing pressure is, we've got our families, we've got our jobs, we've got our lives, we're making our holiday plans. We don't want to be running the government day to day as well as everything else. So there is a sense in which we want reliable people and reliable institutions to take on board the kinds of things that matter, that manage our society, and that they will be doing it in an honest and transparent way, which they can be held accountable for. So, you know, these two things are not exactly kind of consistent with one another in a way. And one thing that would almost inevitably happen in practical terms is that it will be those who are anyway activists who will put themselves forward and who will be another layer of representation. It seems to me that this key matter of representation is one which should definitely include in it the qualification of the people who put themselves forward as representatives, and the fact that there is an extremely clear understanding about what their duties are and what the limits of their powers are, and that there are ways in which we, the people, can recall those who don't really come up to scratch. And indeed, that very idea is lodged in the idea of democracy, because our democracies are intended to be representative democracies. That is, the people who go to the legislature are not merely delegates carrying a message. They are people who are tasked to get the facts, discuss, find out about things, listen to arguments, come to a conclusion, act in the best interest of everybody, do it transparently, and do it accountably. And if we manage to get that right, then these sort of opposing, conflicting pressures, on the one hand, we need a voice, we need to empower people. On the other hand, we don't want people running the government day to day as well as all the rest of their lives. Somehow the representative model can provide us with a way out of that conflict.
So let's get into it and start talking about tech and what tech can do for us here. And we already have a question in the chat. We can start first, since you both alluded to the topic of elections that get us to our representative system. The whole world is going to the polls this year. Are there opportunities here that you see we can, from a positive perspective, and Juan Pablo Giraldo asked this in the chat, do you see opportunities here, he asks, for AI to be helpful in campaigns? And I'll let you read the rest of his question if you would like. But do you see opportunities here for technology to actually be useful in strengthening, improving the practice of our elections? And in what ways? Or are you more worried about the